So instead of doing sort of a PowerPoint presentation, I've been using an app called Canva. It's a free application. It just gives you a lot of really nice visuals to work with. I actually learned about it from my son's kindergarten teacher because she used it to create these really beautiful pictures about their classroom, and it just sort of made it feel really quite real what they were doing. Sure, the app is called Canva. And I'm going to put this link to this page in the chat in case you want to follow along. And if you're someone who likes to have sort of the paper of the presentation to write on, you can click on the link here below to download a copy of this presentation. So I'm just going to give everybody a minute to just get themselves organized and settled. And so for today's purposes, what I wanted to talk about was what exactly I define as trauma-informed teaching and learning, and then how I use those principles to implement them into every course. And then lastly, how to incorporate a couple of some of the newer technologies that I've been using into by using teaching and trauma-informed teaching and learning principles. At the bottom of the little chalkboard screen here, you'll see this quote. I've never been able to find who it was from, but I have always really loved it as sort of a reminder of trauma-informed principles. So embrace empathy and acknowledge each person's individual unique experience. And I think that's some of what we're seeing now as a forward press into our teaching curriculum. And so for trauma-informed teaching, some of the things that we believe, you can see up here in the top left-hand corner of this little whiteboard in the classroom or in the office, it says perspectives matter. Oh, it shouldn't. One moment, please. Hmm. Oh, I see. So if you are not logged in, a second link in the chat box that should work for you. It just required us to be signed in to our Seneca. And let me know if that doesn't work. Okay, so it says perspectives matter. We respect everyone. Your truth matters. Reach out for help. Everyone needs help sometimes. Perfect. Thanks, Anna. And so those are sort of the major contributors to trauma-informed teaching and learning. So what is it? Well, to really understand kind of what that means, it requires you to do a little bit of reflection about what scares you. And so I'm going to take this minute to show an image. If you're triggered by things like Halloween, scary, that sort of thing, I'm going to tell you to close your eyes now, and I'll let you know when that slide is over. Okay, so there's your warning. So if we imagine that this is what you see when you walk into a class, and this visual is on the board, and this is something that you find really scary. So if you're like me, I'm not a Halloween fan. I don't like scary things like this. It makes me very uncomfortable. And so I'm going to keep going. So if that was you and your eyes were closed, you can open them now. For other people, some triggers are a little bit more everyday life. And so a lot of times we find in the literature research that I was doing about this, that grief and loss and things like those seem to be a large trigger for a lot of people. And so I'm going to show another image. If grief or loss is something that has touched you and that is a trigger for you and your emotions, please close your eyes now, and I'll let you know when this slide is over. And so if a student is in a class and you're discussing something about grief or loss, or something that's touched them emotionally, or you're showing a picture like this, often those emotions can be reignited. So you can open your eyes now if your eyes were closed. When we have trauma, we can't learn. And the reason for that is that for those of you in the sciences, you know that we have our amygdala that can get hijacked when we are worried about staying alive, right? It's our survival mechanism. So when we're experiencing trauma, it slows down or completely stops our ability to learn. And that's because the parts of our brain that are sensing a threat are requiring all of your brain to focus on that. And all of your energy is being sent there so that you can survive. And that's how humans have stayed alive for so long, right? Is that we've focused on surviving when our brain tells us that we're in imminent danger. This is a good thing, right? We need that survival instinct. It's what tells your brain to, not put your hand on a hot stove or to not jump off of a cliff or things like that. Our brains help us to stay alive. The problem is that in today's society, we actually don't have that many instances where we're fighting for survival physically. And so we often forget that there is emotional trauma or trauma from stress. So when you're in a constant state of stress, and that can be from school, it can be from home, it can be from COVID, right? That can cause the same reaction. And so people are put into this position where their brain is only trying to survive. It makes it really hard to learn. When we want to establish trauma-informed principles within our teaching and learning, there's about 6 different things that we want to do. The first one is that we want to establish some sort of emotional, cognitive, and physical or interpersonal safety. To do that, you have to establish an environment where people feel that you're trusting them and that they can trust you. And so establishing in the second instance here, peer support and mutual self-help, that's one way that we can do it. So providing an environment where peers can help each other and that that's considered a good and safe thing. And that we have good, really clear and trustworthy communication. And that's the second one. The other one, and I purposely left that word out, transparency. Sometimes as teachers, we are not as clear as we think we are. And transparency has a real effect on our ability to establish trust with our students. We also want to promote shared decision making. This one's really hard, I think, for us as teachers to let go a little bit of the decision making that happens around how our class is going to run, how evaluations are going to be done, even things like due dates. But having some control over the things that are stressing you, which we know school is one of them for our students, can really help to alleviate that trauma response and help them to really focus on learning. The other thing that we want to do is really empower choice. When people have choice, there's less stress, which again allows them to demonstrate their best work, their best learning. We want to make sure that we're empowering a sense of purpose This one, being a nursing teacher, I think comes easy to most nursing professors, I would think, at least all that I know, because our sense of purpose is to care for people. That's why we're taking our program. That's why we do our jobs. So I think it's easy for us to see our sense of purpose. And I think most teachers do a really good job in nursing of helping their students to feel that sense of purpose within choosing the field of nursing. I think that sometimes it's harder in other programs where as part of another program, or it's an introductory program where they're trying to figure out what it is that they want to do. And so I think empowering a sense of purpose in those situations really has to focus on the purpose of being in school. So you came here to learn, you came here to explore self, whatever those reasons are, making them part of your curriculum, making them feel like part of the class. Being aware of cultural, historical, and gender issues, we know is already a large part of what we're looking at when we're building our curriculum and interacting with our students. But it's also part of trauma-informed teaching and learning. We can trigger our students, we can trigger ourselves if we're not being reflective of the cultural, historical, and gender issues of today as well as in the past. Being authentic. This is when I had a really long conversation with a number of students actually this semester about, because it was one of the things I was trying to work on the most myself this semester with my students is being authentic to who I am as a person and authentic to who I am as a teacher, as well as authentic to who I am as a nurse, and putting all three of those in together and being vulnerable to my students in the areas where I have weakness, the areas where I have strength. And the conversations around that with students were eye opening. They really appreciated having the opportunity to express who they were and having a conversation about who I was and how that has engaged in our learning. For instance, what made me want to do forensic nursing? Well, that comes out of a number of things from my personal life, my professional life, my educational life as well. And so explaining that part of myself also helped those students to explain the parts of themselves that were bringing them to this point in their journey. It also really helped me to connect what we were trying to learn in that class back to my students and their authentic self so that we're cementing those nuggets of learning. So some of the ways that we can do this is through assignments. So this is where it gets really interesting to me because one of the easiest ways for us to do this is to really use universal design for learning principles when we're designing our assignments and our course content. Those principles actually fit almost identically, word for word, into trauma-informed principles. And so when I was looking at this about a year ago in preparation for a different presentation on UDL, I realized how hand in hand they went together. And so it actually made this piece about how to actually implement it much easier. I could reach out for examples through UDL to see how that could be implemented using a trauma-informed perspective. And so assignments, having multiple modes of submission, giving them examples of work that was done by other students, of course with permission from the students, of work that was really well done, and then clarity. I put this one in bold because it's my weak spot. So I can write an assignment and a rubric and a description, and I can put lots of pretty pictures on it. And I think I'm being very clear. To the student, however, when I started doing some feedback pieces on my assignment rubrics and descriptions, I was kind of surprised by the lack of clarity that they were getting from it. And so for the past 2 semesters, I've been really working on what language to use to make sure that I'm being clear, and started to see that, using step-by-step instructions was one, and literally saying that step one, do this, step two, do this, and showing examples along the way of all of the different pieces to an assignment. The other thing that I've done is have assignment weapons. So now that we're mostly online, it's really opened up the possibility of having not just a class, but having multiple sessions within a class. And so instead of having a 3 hour window of a class, I can have, three 1 hour drop-ins for an assignment where we can discuss in smaller groups um, the ins and outs of each assignment, and students have the opportunity to pitch what they're thinking about doing in an assignment and whether that's on the right track, or if I can give them some feedback about where they might want to go for further research, further clarity on their subject matter, things like that. So that was a big learning. And then check-ins. So at the start of a class, like I was starting at this one, having an anonymous expression of check-in just is a way to help people center on how they're feeling in that moment. Most of us don't do this. It wasn't my practice for a very long time until I realized that I was going from class to class, stressed out, and it was hard to start my class authentically because I was still thinking about the 50 million things that came across my plate at the end of the last class. And through some work with friends of mine through forensic nursing, who are social workers, they were talking a lot about taking moments before each session that they had to check about how they're feeling in that moment, acknowledging it, and then letting it go. And I thought, wow, if students could do that, just sort of check in when they got to my class, maybe they would be able to set aside whatever it is that's stressing them at that moment, calm their brain, and allow them to learn. That would be a really beneficial practice. And I happened to go to a conference last year where the conference presenter actually did that. And as the participant, I actually found it really helpful. Now, mind you, that what didn't work today is a tech glitch, right? What I didn't do today was start out with how to. So most of the time in my classes, we start out with a how to use the technology session, which usually takes about half an hour to 45 minutes. Um, in week one and week two for those who are late to start the course, which I didn't do in this one. I just assumed everybody knew how to use the whiteboard, which, that's mark against me there. But there's lots of ways to do those check-ins, and it doesn't necessarily have to be with the whiteboard. You can do a multiple choice poll if you like to use the polling feature, or if you like to use Mentimeter or any of those tools. You could do a poll, an anonymous poll, to see how people are. It's really just to get people to stop and take a breath and think about it. That's all it does. The next thing is about having open communication between classes. Students have really pushed about this probably over the past year the most within COVID, that they can't always in the moment after class think about what it was that they had a question about, or what it was that they needed some clarity on, and that they need to come back to that. And often they're using email to do that. And I don't know about you, but I get a lot of email. And so I don't always, when I'm replying, I think give them the clarity that they need. It's not a back and forth exchange, kind of like talking to the person. And so for the past year, I've done two things. One is institute more drop-ins, so face-to-face conversations like this. And I always try to make sure at least one of them is an evening session, and then one of them a daytime session, just to allow for some flexibility. And then the other one that I've done, which we're going to be exploring shortly, is using a communication app, a heavily encrypted one called Signal. That probably has been the biggest break for me with my classes in communication. It had the best feedback, and it was the easiest for me to use. And again, that's my practice though, so you have to try out all these things and figure out what works for you. And then lastly, due dates. So we know that mastery of content requires multiple attempts, right? You have to do something usually more than once to be really good at it. And we don't often allow for that mastery within undergraduate or even college level courses. And so I think that's one of the ways that we have gone away from um, a learning space that is better suited for mastery of information. And then having soft due dates and hard due dates. For instance, the last day of the last week of the semester is not a good time to hand in a major paper or project. So I try to make sure I don't have a due date on that day for anything that's, requires a lot of marking. That's for me because, I have 3 days to get my marks in, as you are all well aware, I'm sure. So I like to talk to the students about what is the hard date. So if all in your life, what's the last date that I can take an assignment and be able to mark it and give it the feedback it deserves and give you the mark that you deserve? And so we have that conversation at the beginning of the semester, and then we have it a couple of more times throughout the semester. Um, that's also part of having sort of a UDL approach where I have um, a lot of conversations around due dates and the fact that you don't need a letter of accommodation to ask for an extension on something. What I do need is a conversation. I need you to check in with me and let me know that you're in that position, and that you are not going to be able to give me your best work on that date because of, life. And that happens to all of us. And so I like to have that conversation multiple times so that people know that I would like to have your work on this date, but I must have it by this date. And those dates are something that we can sometimes talk about, depending on what's happening in other courses, of course. So just before we move on to the technology piece, I just wanted to pause and ask if there was anything, any questions or anything that I can clarify in that last piece. And if you're okay, good to go, then just give me a good to go.
Looks like we're good to go, Siobhan.
Tablet, if you have a smartphone, or if you are on a desktop computer, any of those will work. And I'm just going to share my other screen, so bear with me. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to Chrome if you're on a desktop, and you're going to type in Signal and just look it up as a Google search, and you'll find the Signal website to sign up. And you don't have to participate if you don't want to. You can just follow along. The other thing, if you're using a smartphone, then you can go to your app store and download the Signal app. And I'm going to, while people are doing that, if you want to participate, I'm going to pop our group link for Signal into the chat box. So when you get Signal to download and you sign in, or you can just click this link and it will take you to the Signal sign-in page. And what it's going to do is connect you to the group that I've created. So as a teacher, what I did was I created a group for my class, and then I posted the group link to my Blackboard announcements. Wasn't mandatory for students to use it. However, I did get 100% of my students using it. There we go. So welcome, Irene. And so this is just like any kind of text-based chat messaging. You just type in, you can send emojis. This is one of my favorite ones because he's very cute. You can send gifts. You can send voice messages by clicking on the little microphone. Great question, Irene. So I've used both Signal and Discord. I find Discord a lot harder to use with my mature students. A lot of them have worked out how to use things like Facebook and Messenger and how to text and things like that. But not all of them are sort of gamers, and Discord kind of has a real gamer feel to it. um, they find it sort of hard to navigate all of the pieces of it, and I also have some issues with the background IT piece of it. It's not as heavily encrypted as Signal. Um, so those are the two reasons why I chose Signal over Discord. I did use Discord last semester, not this past one, but the one before, so fall. And I only got about 60% of my students that signed in. And the feedback I got at the end was, again, it felt too hard to use. It felt bulky on the screen, things like that. And then I was introduced to Signal from another teaching group that I'm part of. And um, it's just really clean looking, and it's easy to use. It doesn't require a lot of technology knowledge to um, to use it as sort of the recipient and not necessarily setting up a group and things like that. And I liked that it sort of it didn't require a lot of permissions and things. All of the encryption is built into the back end, which for me is helpful, where Discord requires a lot of setup if you want to be heavily encrypted and things like that. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question? Awesome. So it also lets you, if you wanted to put a picture in, for instance, sometimes I would send a picture of something that was interesting that had to do with our weekly content, or a video even. If I found a video that was interesting that I just came across in my week, I would send it on here. I also posted it to Blackboard because I was cognizant that I didn't yet know at the beginning of the semester if all my students were going to join. And so I tried to post everything in both so that nobody was missing out. But by about week 4, I had 100% of the students in the course signed up for Signal. And so I stopped posting in Blackboard and just posted here, which actually meant I posted probably a lot more frequently because I could post right from my phone. And so as I was scrolling through, LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or something, and I would come across something in the news or on Twitter, actually, I found a lot of stuff on Twitter. Then I could just forward it to my group and say, what do you think of this? And so we actually had a lot of really good conversations about the week's topic via Signal versus saving all of our sort of teaching moments or Socratic questioning let's say that, instead of saving it for that 3 hour window. And so it just was a really rich experience. And so that's Signal. It's that's really all there is to it. You can use it to do a video call if you wanted to with a student. You can make your messages disappear, which if I turned on when I was having private conversations. So outside of the group, I can send a private message to a student. And so what I did was, for their privacy, I turned on this disappearing message function. So after our conversation, they were assured that that conversation was private and that after 30 seconds of leaving that conversation, it all disappeared. And that was really helpful because a lot of my students were experiencing a lot of stress from family members who were becoming positive with COVID. There was a few deaths of family members related to COVID, and trouble managing, having your kids at home and not in school, a lot of that sort of stuff. So it was a lot more just providing a safe place for them to just say, this is how I'm feeling. And I just need you to know that this is where I'm at because it's affecting my ability to learn in your class. And that was really helpful in then having some moments to say, okay, thank you for connecting with me. Thank you for letting me know. I hear you. Um, what about when you're feeling like you're in a better space? Why don't we connect one-on-one? And let's just go back over the learning objectives for that week and just make sure that you have understood, or that if you have questions, I can provide some more ways for you to connect. So this can be potentially a lot more time consuming, um, but I did find that for me, it was less time consuming because I didn't have to worry as much about how I was going to pack everything that I needed to talk about into 3 hours without using that 3 hours as a lecture, which we know is not good teaching practice, right? So that is Signal. Are there any questions about this one? I'm going to leave the group link up, and I will post it into the document for this presentation. So if you want to try it out, you can just join this group and message and play with the functions and things like that. So it'll be open for probably the next 60 days or so before I shut it down. So if you want to play with it after, please feel free to. Okay, so lastly, I want to show you this new learning environment. And I'm just going to reshare a different screen. Bear with me. So this is Learnful. I'm going to go back to it is a community of inquiry and practice for making, discovering, sharing anything that's an open educational resource. And so there's a lot of teachers who post things that they've made on here that you can remix and share. Very similar in sort of like an H5P for those that have played with H5P. This site was actually built by two guys who were originally the ones who built H5P. And so they took their lessons learned from building H5P and decided that, the good things about H5P are creating interactive and adaptive quizzing and all sorts of interactive resources. But the bad you build were built with HTML and able to be embedded in any LMS or website. So what I did was I would come in and create all sorts of different things. So for instance, this one is a drag and drop, which you can do in H5P. The nice thing about using Learnful is that I could take this H5P module that I've built and add it to a learning module. And so if I go and look at all the learning modules that I've built, I'm just going to pull up this one. What I did was I created a lesson, and I'll show you the dashboard of all the different things you can create. But the lesson lets me pull in pictures that I have saved or created. I usually create my own pictures. It's slowly loading. It lets me pull in some case study. It lets me build an assignment. So in this section, I had them working through a case study. And so I'm just going to take us down. So here you can see I've embedded that H5P interactive drag and drop, and I've put it into my lesson. So the nice thing about Learnful is that I can, and these are not right, I'm just dropping them wherever, is that you can take all of the different pieces that you've built for maybe other lessons and recombine them into a new lesson. And so I built the rule of nines for actually a different course, but it was a good important one to add to this case study lesson. And so I was able to remix it and then add in some other ones that I've made. So, using a multiple choice, I could pull in a picture and then continue on with some more information. And then lastly, I pulled in a document builder. And so you can actually build in H5P an entire interactive process that at the end of the day will let them submit something to you. So I'm just going through and typing gibberish so that it will let me show you the last screen. And so what this does is at the end of all of these questions, it lets them create a document with all of their answers in it, which they can export, and then they can upload it into a submission portal in Blackboard in order for you to use it for marking if you wanted to. In this case, it was just to hand it in to say it was done, just so I could see where the different groups had sort of ended up as an outcome for this case, and give them some feedback in class. And so it works really well, but from the student's perspective, and I'm just going to go straight up to the top, is that it looks really clean. It's easy to use, it's easy to navigate. They didn't require any other sort of support to use it. And from my perspective, as the creator, go all the way to the bottom, all I had to do was copy this embed code and place it into an item in my Blackboard shell. And what the student sees in Blackboard is this tile. And so all they need to do is click on Launch Resource, and it takes them to Learnful. So when I'm doing this and using UDL and trauma-informed principles, I try to make sure at the beginning that we're doing a check-in and that my timelines for doing this are not, you have 15 minutes as a group to work through this. I usually would have this posted in their Blackboard shell for them to start working on the week before the class as they're working through the material and the reading. And then when we come to our live in-person session, it's a chance for us to work through the answers that they've already done, and use that time to discuss them and take and if they've gone in the wrong direction, to correct the direction. And so that's a really short, quick look at Learnful. Lastly, I just want to show you where the create resources are. So in this create resources piece, you can see you can create an H5P resource. You can create a lesson, and so that's what I showed you was a lesson. You can also create modules, and I haven't completed one, but I probably will be completing one by the end of the summer, where I will stack all the lessons that I've created into a module. Um, the biggest question I think that people ask about this is why? Why do this versus building it in Blackboard? The reason for me is that one, it's cleaner to look at. Blackboard from a student's view tends to look very chunky. They don't always know how to access everything. There's a lot of stuff on the page. And secondly, it lets me create and keep my material outside of Blackboard. And I like that because sometimes Blackboard is not cooperative and sometimes it doesn't properly. And so this lets me the repository where I can share with colleagues across the province, across Canada, but also have a place where I know if I can go back to and pull that content forward into a new course without having to worry about it getting corrupted from, multiple revisions or multiple copies over from previous semesters. And yeah, so that's Learnful. And I think my time is up. Thank you so much for joining me. Any questions? Oh, Irene. Okay, so I love your question, Irene. I love Google Sites. I use Google Sites for pretty much everything. What I love about Learnful is that I can embed it in my Google site. And I say that because H5P doesn't embed as nicely into the Google Sites as it does into Learnful. It kind of gets stretched out depending on the screen that they're viewing it on. But when you embed a Learnful module or lesson, sorry, into a Google site, it looks beautiful when they use it on a phone or when they use it on an iPad or a desktop computer. So that's why I like it. Um, and Google Sites they've also put a lot of restriction now on what you can embed. And they've taken away the ability to embed Adobe, which I used to use a lot of Adobe Spark and other things to embed in there to make it, more interactive and nice to look at. And so Learnful has really filled that sort of that hole for me. Does that answer your question? Perfect. No problem. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. If you have a question, please feel free to check back with me.